This is Chesterton Radio. Tonight, we begin a journey with Gabriel Gale, the poet who paints his way through madness and light. In a world that calls him eccentric, he meets those who have gone a little further, perhaps too far, into imagination. The Poet and the Lunatics by G.K. Chesterton. Episode 1. The Fantastic Friends. The inn called the Rising Sun had an exterior rather suggesting the title of the Setting Sun. It stood in a narrow triangle of garden, more grey than green, with broken-down hedges mingling with the melancholy reeds of a river, with a few dark and dank arbours of which the roofs and the seats had alike collapsed, and a dingy, dried-up fountain with a weather-stained water-nymph and no water. The house itself seemed rather devoured by ivy than decorated with it, as if its old bones of brown brick were slowly broken by the dragon coils of that gigantic parasite. On the other side, it looked on a lonely road leading across the hills down to a ford across the river, now largely disused since the building of a bridge lower down. Outside the door was a wooden bench and table, and above it a wooden sign, much darkened, with the gold of the sun's disk faded to a brown. And under the sign stood the innkeeper, gazing gloomily up the road. His hair was black and flat, and his face, of a congested purple, had all the somberness, if not all the beauty, of sunset. The only person in the place who exhibited any liveliness was the person who was leaving it. He was the first and last customer for many months, a solitary swallow who had conspicuously failed to make a summer. And the swallow was now flitting. He was a medical man on a holiday, young and of an agreeable ugliness, with a humorous hatchet face and red hair, and the cat-like activity of his movements contrasted with the stagnant inertia of the inn by the ford. He was strapping up his own bag on the table under the sign, and neither his host, who stood a yard off, nor the single servant who moved heavily and obscurely within offered to help him. Possibly through sulkiness, possibly merely through dreaminess and disuse. The long silence, idle or busy, was broken for the first time by two sharp and explosive sounds. The first one was the abrupt bursting of the strap that the doctor was tightening around the bag on the table, and the second was the loud and cheerful "damn," which was his comment upon it. "Here's a pretty go," observed the medical gentleman, who went by the name of Garth. "I shall have to tie it up with something. Have you got a cord or a rope or anything?"
"Acid is the kind of tonic I feel inclined for," answered the landlord of the Rising Sun. "I never recommend it," observed the doctor cheerfully. "It's very pleasant at the moment, no doubt, but I never feel I can guarantee a complete recovery afterwards. But you certainly seem down in the mouth. You didn't even brighten up when I indulged in such an eccentricity as paying my bill." "Much obliged to you, sir," observed the other gruffly, "but it would want a lot more bills to keep this rotten old show from going a pot. It was a good business once, when the right-of-way was open beyond the river and everybody used this ford. But the last squire shut up the path somehow, and now everything goes by the new bridge a mile away. Nobody comes this way, and saving your presence, I don't know why anybody should." "Well, they say the new squire is nearly bankrupt himself," observed Dr. Garth. "So history brings its revenges. Westermain's his name, isn't it? I'm told there's a brother and sister living in the big house over there with precious little to live on. I suppose the whole countryside's rather gone downhill. But you're wrong about nobody coming here," he added suddenly, "for there are 2 men coming over the hill now." The road ran across the valley at right angles to the river. Beyond the ford, the forgotten right-of-way could be traced more faintly up the slope, to where the ruined gate that marked Westermain Abbey stood dark against clouds of a pallor that was faintly lurid, as with a hint of storm. But on the other side of the valley the sky was clear, and the early afternoon seemed as bright and brisk as morning. And on this side, where the white road curved over the hill, 2 figures were advancing which seemed, even when they were hardly more than dots in the distance, to be markedly dissimilar. As they came nearer to the inn, the contrast increased, and was accentuated by the very fact of their air of mutual familiarity, as if they were almost walking arm in arm. One was comparatively short and very sturdy, the other unusually tall and slender. They were both fair, but the blond hair of the shorter man was neatly parted and smoothly plastered down, while that of the other stood up in erratic wisps and tufts that looked fantastic. The shorter man had a full, square face, sharpened by a very pointed nose, and a pair of bright, bird-like eyes that made it look like a small beak. There was something of the cock-sparrow about him, and indeed he seemed more of a town bird than a country bird. His clothes were as neat and commonplace as a clerk's, and he carried a business-like little bag as if he was going up to the city, while his tall companion had bundled on his back a loose knapsack and what was evidently the paraphernalia of a painter. He had a long, slightly cadaverous face, with absent-minded eyes, but the chin beneath jutted forward almost as if it had formed an unconscious resolution of its own, of which the blank blue eyes were still unaware.
They were both young, and they both walked without hats, probably through the heat of walking. For the one held a hard straw hat in his hand, and the other had a loose grey felt stuffed anyhow into his knapsack. They came to a halt before the inn, and the shorter man said jovially to his companion, "Here's a field for your efforts, anyhow." Then he called out with breezy civility to the innkeeper, asking him to bring out 2 pots of ale. And when that gloomy character had disappeared into his gloomy place of entertainment, he turned to the doctor with the same radiant loquacity. "My friend's a painter," he explained, "but rather a special sort of painter. You might call him a house painter, but he's not quite what most people mean by one. It may surprise you, sir, but he's an R.A., and not the stuffy sort that sometimes suggests either. One of the first among the young geniuses, and exhibits at all their cranky galleries. But his whole aim and glory in life is to go about repainting inn signs. There, you don't meet a genius with that little fancy every day. What's the name of this pub?" And he stood on tiptoe, craning and peering at the blackened sign with an extraordinary contained vivacity in his curiosity.
"The rising sun," he commented, turning eagerly again to his silent friend. "That's what you would call an omen, after what you were saying this morning about reviving the real inns. My friend is very poetical, and he said it would make a sunrise all over England." "Well, they say the sun never sets on the British Empire," observed the doctor with a laugh. "I don't feel it about the empire so much," said the painter, simply, breaking his silence like one spontaneously thinking aloud. "After all, one doesn't fancy an English inn on the top of Mount Everest or somewhere on the Suez Canal, but one's life would be well spent in waking up the dead inns of England and making them English and Christian again. If I could do it, I would do nothing else till I die." "Of course you can do it," replied his traveling companion. "A picture by an artist like you and hung outside a public house makes it fashionable for miles round." "Is it really true, then," inquired Dr. Garth, "that you employ all your serious powers on subjects like public-house signs?" "What finer subjects are there, even as subjects?" asked the painter. He was now evidently full of his favorite subject, and he was one of those who are either abstractly silent or ardently argumentative. "Is it more dignified to paint an Academy portrait of some snobbish mayor in a gold chain, or some swindling millionaire's wife in a diamond tiara, than to paint the heads of great English admirals to be toasted in good ale? Is it better to paint some nepotistic old noodle wearing his George and Garter than to paint St. George himself in the very act of killing the dragon? I've repainted 6 old signs of St. George and the dragon, or even the dragon without St. George. A sign called the Green Dragon is usually very suggestive to anybody."
With a little imagination, you can make him a sort of spirit and terror of tropical forests. Even a blue boar is suggestive, something nocturnal with stars like the Great Bear, like that dim monstrous boar that stood for chaos and old night in the Celtic mythology. And he reached for his pewter pot and applied himself to it with absorption. "He's a poet as well as a painter, you know," explained the smaller man, still regarding his companion with an absurd air of proprietorship, as if he himself were the keeper and showman of some singular wild animal. "You've probably heard of the poems of Gabriel Gale, illustrated by himself. I can get you a copy if you are interested in these things. I'm his agent and businessman. My name's Hurrell, James Hurrell. People laugh at us and call us the Heavenly Twins because we're inseparable, and I never let him out of my sight. Have to look after him. Eccentricities of genius, you know." The painter took his face off the pewter pot, a face fiery with controversy. "Genius oughtn't to be eccentric," he cried in some excitement. "Genius ought to be centric. It ought to be in the core of the cosmos, not on the revolving edges. People seem to think it a compliment to accuse one of being an outsider and to talk about the eccentricities of genius. What would they think if I said, I only wish to God I had the centricities of genius?" "I fear they would think it was the beer," replied Dr. Garth, "that had slightly confused your polysyllables. Well, it may be a romantic idea to revive the old signs, as you say. Romance is not much in my line." Mr. Hurrell, the agent, cut in sharply and even eagerly. "But it isn't only a romantic idea, too. I'm a businessman, and you may believe me, it's really a business proposition. Not only for us, but for the other people too, for the innkeepers and the villagers and the squires and everybody. Why, look at this broken-down alehouse they call the Rising Sun. If everyone would work together, they could have this empty hole humming like a hive in a year. If the squire would open the old road and let people visit the ruins, if he'd build a bridge here by the inn and hang out a sign painted by Gabriel Gale, you'd have all the cultivated sightseers in Europe stopping here for lunch. "Hello!" cried the doctor. "It looks as if they were coming to lunch already. Really, our pessimistic friend inside talked as if this were a ruin in the desert, but I begin to believe it does a trade like the Savoy." They had all been standing with their backs to the road, looking at the dark tavern under discussion. But even before the doctor began to speak, Gabriel Gale, the painter and poet, had become in some odd fashion conscious of an addition to the company. Perhaps it was because the elongated shadows of a horse and two human figures had for some little time rested on the sunny road beside him. He turned his head over his shoulder
and remained staring at what he saw. A high dog-cart had drawn up on the other side of the road. The reins were in the gloved hands of a tall, dark young lady, clad in dark blue of the tailor-made type, neat but not particularly new. By her side was a man, perhaps 10 years older than herself, but seeming in many ways much more, for his high-featured face was wasted as with sickness, and there was a great anxiety in his large gray eyes. In the momentary silence, the clear voice of the girl came like an echo of the doctor's phrase, saying, "I am sure we can get some lunch here." She slipped lightly to the ground and stood by the horse's head, while her companion descended with a little more hesitation. He was dressed in light tweeds, which seemed somehow slightly incongruous with his invalid air, and he addressed Hurl with a rather nervous smile. "I hope you won't regard me as an eavesdropper, sir, but you were not exactly speaking as if you were talking secrets." Hurl, indeed, had been talking as if he were a cheapjack, dominating the noise of the fair, and he smiled and answered quite pleasantly, "I was only saying what anybody might about what 12 a squire might do with a property like this. I don't in the least mind anybody listening who happens to be interested." "I happen to be a little interested," answered the man in tweeds, "because, as it happens, I am the squire, if there are any squires nowadays." "I sincerely apologize," answered the agent, still smiling, "but if you will play Harun al-Rashid—" "Oh, I'm not at all offended," answered the other. "To tell the truth, I'm rather wondering whether you aren't quite right." Gabriel Gale had been looking at the girl in dark blue rather longer than was quite polite, but painters and absent-minded persons may sometimes be excused in such cases. His friend would probably have infuriated him by calling it one of the eccentricities of genius, but it might have been disputed whether his admiration was entirely eccentric. Lady Diana Westermain would have made a most satisfactory sign for an inn, a bush worthy of the best wine, or might even have uplifted the lowly estate of an Academy picture, though it was long since her unfortunate family could have easily afforded one. She had hair of a curious dark brown, which in ordinary shades looked black, while the lights in it looked almost red. Her dark eyebrows had a touch of temper, both in the good and the bad sense. Her eyes were even larger and grayer than her brother's, but less filled with mere worry, and more with a more spiritual weariness. Gale had the sense that her soul was more hungry than her body. But he also had the thought that people are only hungry because they are healthy.
He thought all this in the brief moments before he remembered his manners and turned to consider the other group. When he had left off looking at her, she began looking at him, but with a somewhat cooler curiosity. Meanwhile, Mr. James Hurl had been working wonders, not to say miracles, with something more than ordinary diligence.
Than the tenacity of a tout, with something of the eloquence of the born diplomatist, he had already wound round the squire a web of suggestions and proposals and possibilities. There was really something about him of that imaginative businessman of whom we hear so much and see so little. Affairs which a man like Westermain could never normally have conceived as being settled except by long lawyers' letters extending over several months, seemed to be arranging themselves before him in several minutes. A new bridge of the most artistic woodwork seemed already to point across the river to the open road. A new and higher class of rents seemed already to be dotting the valley with artistic villages, and a new golden sign of the rising sun, with the signature of Gabriel Gale, already blazed above them, a symbol that the sun had risen indeed. Before they knew where they were, the whole company had been bustled in the most friendly fashion through the inn and set down to a luncheon that was really a committee round the table in the dreary garden beside the river. Hurrell was drawing plans on the wooden table and making calculations on pieces of paper and reeling off figures and answering objections and growing every moment more restless and radiant. He had one piece of magic for making others believe, the fact that he evidently believed himself, and the squire, who had never met such a person before, had no weapons with which to fight him, even if it had been his interest to do so. Amid all this whirl, Lady Diana looked across at Gale, who sat at the opposite corner of the table, somewhat detached and dreamy. "What do you think of it, Mr. Gale?" she said. But Gale's business adviser answered for him, as he answered for everybody and answered for everything. "Oh, it's no good asking him about business," he cried boisterously. "He's only one of the assets. He brings in all the artistic people. He's a great painter, but we only want a painter to paint. Lord bless you, he won't mind my saying that. He never minds what I say or what anybody says, for that matter. He doesn't answer a question for about half an hour as a rule." Nevertheless, the painter answered the lady's question under the time specified, but all he said was, "I think we ought to consult the innkeeper." "Oh, very well," cried the resilient Hurrell, leaping up. "I'll do that now, if you like. Back in a minute." And he disappeared again through the dark interior of the inn. "Our friend is very eager," said the squire, smiling. "But after all, those are the sort of people who get things done. I mean practical things." The lady was again looking at the painter with a slightly constricted brow. She seemed to be almost sorry for him in his comparative eclipse, but he only smiled and said, "No, I'm no good at practical things." Almost as he spoke, a noise like a sort of cry came through the inn from the road beyond, and Dr. Garth sprang to his feet and stood peering in at the door. The next moment, Gale also seemed to rouse himself with a sort of sudden agitation, and the moment after that the others were all following the doctor, who had already started through the house. But when he came to the front door, Gale turned for a moment, barring the exit with his tall figure, and said, "Don't let the lady come out." The squire had already seen over the painter's shoulder a horrible instantaneous image. It was the black figure of a man hanging from the signboard of the Rising Sun. It was only instantaneous, for the next moment Dr. Garth had cut him down, with the assistance of Hurrell, who had presumably uttered the first cry of alarm. The man over whom the doctor was bending was the unfortunate innkeeper, and this was apparently the form in which he took his prussic acid. After being busy in silence for a few moments, the doctor gave a grunt of relief and said, "He's not dead.
In fact, he'll be all right presently." Then he said, with a sort of disgust, "Why the devil did I leave that rope there instead of tying up my bag like a tidy professional man? I forgot all about it in all this fuss. Well, Mr. Hurrell, the sun nearly rose too late for somebody." Hurrell and the doctor carried the unfortunate innkeeper into his inn, the latter declaring that the would-be suicide would soon be in a position to be questioned, if questioning was necessary. Gale paced up and down outside in his aimless fashion, frequently frowning at the sign that had served as a gallows, and the table that had probably served as the proverbial stool kicked away, with a frown that seemed not only pained but puzzled. "This is a most distressing business," said the squire. "Of course, I am a magistrate and all that, but I should hate to have to trouble the poor fellow with the police." At the sound of the word, Gabriel Gale swung round and said in a loud, harsh voice, "Oh, I forgot the police. Of course, he must be locked up in a cell to show him that life is worth living after all, and the world a bright, happy place to live in." He laughed shortly and frowned heavily, and then, after ruminating a moment, said with a certain abruptness, "Look here, I want to ask you a favor, which may seem an odd one. I want you to let me question this poor chap when he comes to. Give me 10 minutes alone with him, and I will promise to cure him of suicidal mania better than a policeman could." "But why you especially?" asked the doctor, in some natural annoyance. "Because I am no good at practical things," answered Gale, "and you have got beyond practical things." There was another silence, and he spoke again with the same strange air of authority. "What you want is an unpractical man. That is what people always want in the last resort and the worst conditions. What can practical men do here? Waste their practical time in running after the poor fellow and cutting him down from one pub sign after another? Waste their practical lives watching him day and night too?
See, he doesn't get hold of a rope or a razor. Do you call that practical? You can only forbid him to die. Can you persuade him to live? Believe me, that is where we come in. A man must have his head in the clouds and his wits wool-gathering in fairyland before he can do anything so practical as that." The group felt a growing bewilderment at his new attitude. It seemed to fill the stage in a strange fashion, nor was it lessened when he actually or apparently fulfilled his undertaking, coming out of the inn 20 minutes afterwards and cheerfully announcing that the innkeeper would not hang himself again. The next moment he had jumped on to the table under the sign 18 with a large piece of chalk in his hand and was making sketchy and slashing strokes of design on the brown face of the rising sun. Lady Diana was looking on at the operation with a dark and watchful face. She was of a type more intellectual than the others, and she recognized a real thread of thought running through all that seemed to them transcendental tomfoolery. She had understood the implied irony of his first reference to their host, the moral that had come before the frightful fable. After all, they had certainly been thinking of everything about the inn except the innkeeper. She could see there was an intelligent case and a practical example of the occasions when the poet can be more useful than the policeman. But she was conscious also of something baffling about him above and beyond all this, of a disquiet in him with some deeper cause, and something in his eye that belied the new levity of his manner. His draftsmanship, however, was proceeding in the most dashing and even dazzling fashion when Lady Diana spoke. "I can't think how you can do it," she said, "on the very place where a man has hung himself like Judas." "It was the treason, not the despair of Judas that was really bad," he answered. "I was just thinking of something like that for the picture. I prefer it to Apollo and all that for a treatment of the sunrise. Look here, you have a big head blocked in with some shadows in the center." And he made some bold markings on the sun's disk, his dark face hidden in his hands like that, but a burst of golden dawn behind like a glory, red bars of level cloud and a red cock just there, the greatest of sinners and of saints, his reproach the cock, and his halo the rising sun. The nameless shadow seemed to have fallen from him as he talked and worked, and by an almost symbolic coincidence, the strong afternoon sun fell with a strange fullness and splendor upon him and his work, which shone out against a blackening background of clouds continually gathering and darkening on the stormy side of the valley beyond the ford. Against those masses of sinister purple and indigo, his figure looked like that of some legendary craftsman, clad in gold and painting the frescoes of a golden chapel. The impression increased as the head and halo of the Judas rising sun were belted by bold glares from the conatal setting sun.
St. Peter grew under his hand, and the lady was of the sort not disinclined to dream herself back in some distant period, about which she did not know too much. She felt herself back among the sacred arts and crafts of the medieval world, which were all she knew of the medieval world. Unfortunately, a shadow came between her and the sun in a shape that did not remind her of the medieval world. Mr. James Hurrell, the agent, his stiff hat a little on one side, jumped onto the same table on which the artist stood, and sat within 2 yards of him, with dangling legs and somewhat aggressive cigar. "Always have to keep an eye on him, your ladyship, or he'd be 20 giving 'em away," he called out, and somehow his voice and figure failed to fit in with the picture of pious and primitive craftsmanship. Diana Westermain explained to herself lucidly that she had no sort of reason to be angry, but she was exceedingly angry. The conversation of the two had no particular intimacy, but its increase to 3 had a very practical and painful effect of intrusion. She could not imagine why the artist, who was a gentleman, should go about with such a little bounder as his business adviser, and she wanted to hear more about the picture of St. Peter, or something interesting. As the agent sat down, he had audibly observed something about making room for a little one. If he, at that moment, had been suddenly suspended from the sign, it is doubtful if the lady would have cut him down. At this moment, a much quieter voice said in her ear, "Excuse me, but might I have one word with you?" She turned and found Dr. Garth with his bag in his hand, evidently about to resume his journey at last. "I'm going, and I feel I really ought to tell you something before I go." He drew her a little way up the road of his departure, and then turned with an abrupt and hurried air of farewell. Doctors are often in delicate situations, and a troublesome sense of duty drives me to saying a rather delicate thing. I tell it to you, and not your brother, because I think you have the long way the better nerve of the two. There is something I suspect about those 2 men who go about painting signs. From where they stood on the higher ground, she could still see the sign itself shining with its new accretion of colors, and the tall, actively moving figure shining also with sunlight, and from that distance altogether dwarfing the small and dingy figure near his feet. There returned on her still more strongly the vision of a true creator, making pure colors in the innocent morning of the world. They are called the heavenly twins because they are inseparable. Well, there are many kinds of couples that are inseparable, and many causes for their never separating. But there is one sort that specially concerns me, and I should be sorry to see mixed up with you. I haven't the least—
"I have no idea what you mean," replied Lady Diana. "What about a lunatic and his keeper?" said the doctor, and walked on rapidly along the road, leaving her behind him. She had the sensation of furiously flinging a suggestion from her, from the top of a high tower to the bottom of an abyss, combined with the sensation that the tower was not high enough, nor the abyss deep enough. She even had the novel sensation that there was something weak about her throwing. While the tower of her mind was still rocking with the effort, she was interrupted by her brother, who came hastily and even excitedly towards her. "I've just asked these gentlemen across to our place," he said, "to fix up this business better. And we'd better be starting, for there's a storm beating up, and even the ford sometimes gets pretty dicky. As it is, we shall have to cross 2 at a time in our own rotten old cart." It was in a sort of dream that she found herself again untethering the horse and again taking the reins. It was in a dream that she heard the voice that irritated her so much saying, "Heavenly twins, you know! Heavenly twins, we mustn't be parted!" And then the voice of the squire replying, "Oh, it'll only be for a minute anyhow. She'll send Wilson back with the dog-cart at once. There's only room for 2 at a time, I'm afraid." They stood a little way back in the doorway of the inn as they talked, and Gabriel Gale had just stepped from the table and was standing nearer to the dog-cart. Then there surged up in her suddenly, she knew not what movement of impatience or defiance, and she said in a matter-of-fact tone, "Are you coming first, Mr. Gale?" The face of the artist blanched as if he were blasted with white lightning in the sunlight. He gave one look over his shoulder and then leapt into the seat beside her, and the horse threw up his head and began to move towards the ford. The rain must have already fallen further upstream, for there was already the sensation of water flowing more deeply about the horse's legs, and though they were only fording a river, she had a hazy sensation of crossing a Rubicon. Enoch Wilson, the groom, one of the small group left at Westermain Abbey, died and was gathered to his fathers without having the faintest notion of the determining part which he played in the dark events of that night. And his private life, though, like that of other immortal spirits, of an intense interest, does not in any other point affect this story. It is enough to say that he was rather deaf, and, like many grooms, more sympathetic with the moods of horses than of men. Lady Diana sought him out in the stable which stood far from the house and near the river, and told him to take the dog-cart back for the rest of the party. She spoke hurriedly and told him to hurry, because the rain would soon make the ford difficult, and her phrases, combined with his own bias, turned his mind chiefly to a consideration of horse. He drove across under the gathering storm, and as he drew near the dark inn, he heard high and excited voices. Mr. Hurl was evidently hot upon his hobby or campaign. The groom got the impression that there was a quarrel, and took a few testy words from his master as meaning that he was not to be disturbed. So the careful Wilson took the horse back across the ford and back into the stable, congratulating himself on having saved the valuable quadruped from the worst inconveniences of what 24 threatened to be a flood. Then he betook himself to his own occupations, leaving a trail of destiny behind him. Meanwhile, Diana Westermain had left the stable and made her way across the grounds to rejoin the guest who had gone in front of her. As she went up through a lane of hollyhocks and tall plants, she saw the vast flying island or continent of rain-cloud, with its volcanic hues and outline, come sailing slowly over the dark, wooded ridge that was the wall of the valley. There was already something faintly lurid about the twilight with which it covered the rich colors of the garden. But higher up the climbing path, a strip of lawn was golden in a chance gleam of sunlight,
and against it she saw the figure she had come to seek. She recognized it by the light brown clothes that had looked like gold in the evening light, but there was something very extraordinary about the shape as distinct from the color. He seemed to be waving his arms slowly like branches in a breeze, and she fancied the arms were unnaturally long. For an instant she had the ugly fancy that the figure was deformed, and yet the unearthly fancy that it had no head. Then the nightmare turned into ordinary nonsense, for the man threw a sort of cartwheel and alighted on his feet laughing. He had actually been standing on his head, or rather on his hands. "Excuse me," he said, "I often do that. It's a very good thing for a landscape painter to see the landscape upside down. He sees things then as they really are. Yes, and that's true in philosophy as well as art." He brooded and then explained explosively. "It's all very well to talk about being topsy-turvy, but when the angels hang head downwards, we know they come from above. It's only those that come from below that always have their noses in the air." Despite his hilarious manner, she approached him with a certain subconscious fear, which was not lessened when he lowered his voice and added, "Shall I tell you a secret?" At the same moment were heard overhead the first heavy movements of the thunder, through which his voice came perhaps as an accidental air as of loud whispering. "The world is upside down. We're all upside down. We're all flies crawling on a ceiling, and it's an everlasting mercy that we don't drop off." At that instant the twilight turned to a white blaze of lightning, and she was shocked to see that his face was quite serious. She said with a sort of irritation, "You do say such crazy things."
And the next moment her voice was lost in the thronging echoes of the thunder, which seemed to shake everything, shouting the same word again and again, "Crazy! Crazy! Crazy!" She had unconsciously given a word for the worst thought in her mind. As yet no rain had fallen on the garden slopes, though the noise of it was already troubling the river beyond. But even had it done so, she herself doubted if the man would have noticed it. Even in more normal moments, he seemed to be one who singly pursued a solitary train of thought, and he was still talking, like a man talking to himself, about the rationality of topsy-turvydom. "We were talking about St. Peter," he said. "You remember that he was crucified upside down. I've often fancied his humility was rewarded by seeing in death the beautiful vision of his boyhood. He also saw the landscape as it really is, with the stars like flowers and the clouds like hills, and all men hanging on the mercy of God." Then a heavy drop of rain fell on him, and the effect of it was indescribable. It seemed to sting him like a wasp and wake him out of a trance. He started and stared around, and then said in a new and more natural voice, "My God, where is Hurrell? What are the others doing? Aren't they here yet?" With an impulse not to be analyzed, Diana dashed through the swaying plants to the top of a neighboring hillock and looked across the valley to the Inn of the Rising Sun. And she saw flowing between them and that place a heavier and wider flood, which in that wild moment looked impassable, like the river of death. In a strange way, it seemed to her a symbol of something greater than the mere grim realism that would have told her, now only too plainly, that she was left alone with the lunatic. Somehow it seemed that the lunacy itself was only a sort of abominable accident and obstacle between her and something that might have been beautiful and a satisfaction of the soul. Another dark river was flowing between her and her own fairy land. At the same moment, Gabriel Gale gave a terrible cry. He also had seen afar off the sundering flood. "You were right after all," he said. "You spoke of Judas when I dared to speak of Peter. I have blasphemed and done the unpardonable sin. I am the traitor now." Then he added in lower and heavier tones, "Yes, I am the man who sold God." The girl's mind was growing clearer with the cold pain of reality. She had heard that maniacs sometimes accuse themselves of the unpardonable sin. Something of her natural courage returned also, and she was ready to do anything, though she did not yet see very clearly what to do. As she was fighting for a solution, the question was settled for her in some degree by her companion himself, who started running down the slope. "I must get across again if I swim the river. I ought never to be away from Hurrell like this. I can never tell what will happen next."
She followed his descent, and was rather surprised to see him deflect it to dart towards the stable. Before she knew where she was, he was struggling with the horse and dragging it out into the shafts, and she felt an irrational pleasure in the fact that he had the strength of a man, if it was the strength of a madman. But her 28 own high spirit and self-respect had returned to her, and there rose in her a furious refusal to be a passive spectator of what might well be merely a suicide. After all, however mad he might be, the man was doing the right thing in trying to rejoin his medical attendant, and she would not have the last effort of his sanity frustrated by the antics of his disease. "I'll drive if we must," she said in a ringing tone. "He'll go better with me." The sun had set behind the hills opposite, and night was already deepening the darkness of the storm. As the rocking vehicle splashed up to the hub of its wheel in the eddying water, she could only faintly see the long water rushes streaming with the stream, as if they were indeed the shades of the underworld, hovering without hope beside the Styx. But she had no longer need to call it merely in metaphor a river of death. Death was driving hard against horse and cart, staggering the insecure foothold of the one and swaying the human burden of the other. The thunder was about their ears, and on their dreadful path scarce any light but the lightning, and her human companion was a man uttering a monologue, of which she heard snatches, more shocking than the thunder. All the reason and realism in her told her that he might at any moment tear her in pieces. But underneath all such things there was something else contrary and incredible, something in the need and the companionship and the courage and heroism she was showing, and it was too deep in her dizzy soul for her to know that it was exultation. The horse almost fell just as they came to the end of the ford, but Gale sprang from the cart and held it, standing knee-deep in water. In a lull in the noise of the storm, she heard for the first time voices from the inn beside the river, voices high and even shrill, as if the altercation that the groom had heard had risen steadily, like the rise of the storm. Then there came what sounded like the crash of a falling chair. Gale dragged the horse to land with the energy of a demon, then dropped the bridle and set off running towards the inn. Even as he did so, a piercing shriek rose into the night from the doors of that solitary and sinister tavern by the river. It died away in a wailing echo along the reedy banks of the river itself, as if the reeds were indeed the lost spirits by the river of Hades, and the very thunder seemed to have stopped and held its breath to hear it.
Out the most minute details of the distance, of the branches and twigs upon the wooded heights, and the clover in the flat fields beside the river. And with the same clarity she saw for an instant something incredible and abominable, and yet not wholly new or unfamiliar. Something that returned in the waking world as a detested nightmare will return in sleep. It was the black figure of a man dangling from the painted gallows of the rising sun. But it was not the same man. Diana was convinced for the moment that she herself had gone mad. She could only imagine dully that her own mind had snapped under the strain, and that the dark objects she saw were but dancing dots upon a void. But one of those black dots had certainly seemed to be the figure of her own brother, thus lassoed to the beam. And the other black dot, literally a dancing dot, had been the figure of that energetic businessman, Mr. James Hurrell. For just then his energy was taking the form of dancing. He was hopping and capering with excitement in front of that frightful signboard. Darkness followed the flash, and a moment after she heard the great voice of Gale himself, a larger and louder voice than she had imagined him to possess, bellowing through the darkness and the stress of wind. "It's all right! He's quite safe now!" Little as she understood of anything yet, she understood with a cold thrill that they had come just in time. She was still dazed when she staggered somehow through the din and distraction of the tempest into the inn parlor, with a smoky lamp on the table, and the three figures of that frustrated tragedy around it. The squire, her brother, in a sort of collapse of convalescence, sat or lay in an armchair with a stiff dose of brandy in front of him. Gabriel Gale was standing up, like one who had taken command, with a face as white but as hard as marble. He was speaking to the man named Hurrell in low, level, and quiet tones, but with one finger pointed, as when a man speaks to a dog. "Go over there and sit by the window. You must keep quite quiet." The man obeyed, taking a seat at the other end of the room, and looked out of the window at the storm, without hearing or seeking to hear the talk of the others. "What does it all mean?" asked Diana at last. "I thought the truth is, Dr. Garth gave me a hint that you were only a lunatic and his keeper." "And so we are, as you see. But the keeper has behaved far worse than the lunatic." "But I thought you were the lunatic," she said with simplicity. "No," he replied. "I am the criminal." They had drawn nearer to the doorway, and their voices also were covered by the noise of the elements, so that they were almost as much alone as when they stood beyond the river. She remembered the earlier dialogue and the violent and mysterious language he had used in it. And she said doubtfully,
You said things like that and worse.
The storm had rolled away along the valley, and the birds were singing after the rain. Stranger things yet were to happen before he and she should meet again. But for the moment she had a curious relapse into repose and contemplation.